Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're joining us for the first time, make sure to hit that subscribe button for deep dives down the rabbit hole of history, captivating interviews, and conversations that make you think.
Asians have also found themselves in danger on their way to and from work.
The whole situation was very, very well organized. Almost a kind of paramilitary type of organization acted behind this whole attack. They waited until the workers came out of this brewery and they were systematically attacked very viciously.
My name is Preeti Dhillon, and I'm a researcher, a writer, and a historian. And I wrote a book called The Shoulders We Stand On, How Black and Brown People Fought for Change in the UK, from the 60s to the 80s. These were movements that fought against racism and capitalism in all areas of life.
I mean, you come to look at it this way. When old Beeching drops his axe, there ain't going to be enough work for the whites, let alone the blacks. We got enough our job now to get a working wage. If we don't get our bit of overtime, we can't live. If they come down here, they'll work all hours God give them.
Today, we delve deep into those lesser-known chapters of Britain's history, bringing to light the struggles and triumphs that have significantly influenced the UK's socio-political fabric.
We all won't be out of work if they start coming on. They'll start ruling the country before long, won't they?
What would you think about coloured people coming to work on the buses?
I don't like the idea very much.
Why not?
I wouldn't like to root with them at night.
With the insights of author Preeti Dhillon, we'll journey through pivotal moments and movements, including the IWA, Bristol Bus Boycott, Black Power, Mangrove Nine, and many,
Personally, I couldn't see it working out. It might, but it does in other towns, but I don't think it would in Bristol, because I think the racial feeling is worse here than in any other town.
But one might wonder what drove Preeti to spotlight this specific era and those particular stories.
That was inspired by seeing Angela Davis speak, the Black American activist, academic, all-round extraordinaire. So she was speaking at an International Women's Day event, and movements are her thing. And she was mentioning all of these movements from the US civil rights context that I'd never heard of. Like for the Montgomery bus boycott, a large part of that success were domestic workers, female domestic workers. And I mean, I, like yourself, I've studied history and fancy myself a historian. I studied American history, and I'd never heard of these movements. And I thought there just must have been also something in the UK. You know, every Black History Month, we talk about Martin Luther King, we talk about Rosa Parks, and who are fantastic and, we well worthy of our study. But, one, Angela Davis cautions against just focusing on exceptional individuals. And two, I thought there must have been something in the UK we can look at. And so I started scratching the surface, and all of these movements just poured out. There were just so many. I was like, I thought I'd have to really search for it, but actually they're right there. There's a lot written about these movements either in academia or like local history projects. So there's information out there if you want to find it. And then I also found a lot of these things took place in Southall, where I grew up, and no one had ever spoken about it. I had no idea. Like I say, I had these kind of vague inklings. I had some idea of some names that might have been important, but didn't know what it all meant. And so the part of that lent itself to looking at the 60s to 80s in particular, at this kind of era of civil rights in the US as well. But for me, it was also really about trying to figure out what happened before I was born. What was the UK that I was born into? Now, I was born in the late 80s, but in school, we only studied up to 1945, right? 1945, and we did that a lot. The Second World War especially, a lot. But, as it is, then nothing happened after that. And so I really wanted to try and fill in some of these gaps of what happened then. What happened before I was born? What was the UK I was born into? Because I came of age during Tony Blair's new Labour government. And that gave me a very distorted idea of what life in the UK is like. And if anything, that was, well, not that that was great anyway, but that was also kind of a blip, actually, from the kind of 50s onwards, and what we can see of what happened in the UK. So, there are many, many reasons, but it was, for me, the 60s to 80s were definitely filling in these gaps and movements to try and show, to try and get away from this individual exceptionalism that we like to focus on.
I was just scanning through the review copy that I had the privilege to read, and there was just something that I noted in the that I had noted down when I was reading it, which I think is worth sharing, which was, it's a book that the author shares the moments and stories kept away from us to make sense of the present. And I think that was kind of the nicest way of condensing it into a nutshell, to say, actually, I think anyone of a particular, actually anyone, it doesn't even need to be a particular generation or a particular background or anything. I think if anyone was to read this book, the amount that they would understand would increase almost exponentially, because so many things were clicking into place as I was reading through this. And obviously we'll get through the book and kind of cover some of the ground, but it's from everything from like healthcare to education to housing to like you name it, and there's some type of issue and movement going on there. And one thing that I found quite shocking, because we definitely don't hear of it, is how pivotal and influential women were in most of these movements, if not all of these movements. Obviously that also ties into perhaps some of the social economic kind of conditions of the time, but it's still something that is really, really underreported. And just on the book, as I was mentioning earlier, I've had the privilege to read 8 out of the 11 chapters, and it's nothing short of remarkable. And I'm not just saying that because you're on this podcast. I'm saying this because it's genuinely an amazingly good read, not just because of how easy it is to read it, but just because of the amount that you learn. And I didn't feel at any point that I wanted to put the book down. For anyone then seeking a profound understanding of history of Black and brown communities in the UK, this book is essential reading. It meticulously charts significant events and movements like police brutality and the community's response in the 80s, the Indian Workers Association, Bristol Bus Boycott, Black Power, Mangrove Nine. Some of these groups and organizations I never heard of until I read your book, like the Fasimbas, the Oval Four, Black Liberation Front, Black Education Movement, Brixton Black Women's Group, and this list goes on and on. You've got OWAAD, Brunswick Strike, the Battle of Brick Lane, Asian Youth Movement, and the Bradford 12. Now, that's a hell of a lot. It covers more than just that. It covers racialized medical care and education. And ingeniously, one thing that I only realized yesterday was the story actually culminates back where it starts, which is in 1981. Now, I wanted to ask, for someone who's had to then write about all of these groups, and I'm sure you've had to research about a hell of a lot more as well, because only 10 have been included in the book, is what are some of those most pivotal moments in the history you cover for yourself, and why?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, absolutely. There was a lot of research that was done, and really also glad that you brought up the role of women. So that one of the first movements I came across, and I think has had a really big influence that we really should know about in the kind of public imagination, is the Brunswick Strike. And so this strike was led by a group of brown women. And these were brown women who'd come over mostly from East Africa, which is important in context because these are women who were used to a certain way of life, who had been often didn't do paid work outside the home, were very middle class or higher class in East Africa. And they were then exiled, came over to the UK, and had to, for some of them the first time, do paid work outside the home. And they weren't going to accept the same kinds of standards that some of the other populations had unfortunately gotten used to. And so a group of women found themselves employed at the Brunswick factory, which was in northwest London. This was a photo processing factory. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to age myself here. I don't know if you're the same age, but when you used to like send off your camera films in envelopes to get them processed. So that was done at places like Brunswick. And the factory specifically employed brown women. They sought brown women. It was actually run by a brown manager, George Ward, which brings in a whole nother level to the conversation. And he even turned white women away, saying, oh, you won't like the kind of wages we pay you here. And pregnant women weren't allowed to go to the doctors. People weren't allowed to go to the toilet. There was compulsory overtime. And one of the workers, Jabin, decided at one point she had enough. And so she stormed out on this really, really hot, in the middle of this hot summer of 1976, where they'd been working really long hours to get everyone's kind of summer photos processed. And on this one Friday in August, she storms out. And by Monday, there were a small group of workers who had joined her, and they all went on strike. And so they didn't know anything about striking. They joined a union, had some support from the local trades union support group, and they went on the picket line. And they were called the strikers in saris, kind of pejoratively by the papers. Because they were standing there. The photos are amazing. They're standing there on the picket line with their saris and their cardigans when the weather kind of set in. But they knew that they needed more support than just the kind of 100 of them, the 20% of them of the workforce that were on the picket line. And so they got the postal workers involved because this was the factory needed postal support. So the postal workers went on strike. But then they were told that they couldn't do that by their union. It was illegal to actually not deliver post. So they had to go back to work. So then they went around the country. The small group of workers, mostly brown women, went around the country and spoke at foundries, at mills, at factories, at the docks. And they rallied the nation's working class. And it's important at this point to say that they were fighting at this moment just for union rights. So they weren't saying necessarily us as brown workers. In some segments they were saying us as brown workers are being treated in such a way. But it was mostly a focus on union rights and getting union recognition at the factory. And so as long as it was a fight for union rights, then they could get this support. But thousands of people joined them. At the height, 20,000 people from all over the country came and joined them on the picket line. Including Arthur Scargill and the miners from Yorkshire, including Labour MPs, including other kind of minor celebrities. And the reason this was such a turning point, I'm going to give a spoiler to your listeners, but they weren't successful, unfortunately. After 2 years of striking, they were not successful. But it was the first time there was a real show of solidarity with brown workers. There were other examples from other years where the unions had not been behind brown workers at all. I mean, especially brown women. And it was the first time that the unions were really on board. It was the first time that the rest of the working class were really showing the solidarity with brown women. And it really showed the nation that, oh, okay, brown women aren't just meek and submissive, and we have to kind of pay attention. And so it was a real turning point for that. But also, it was a turning point in what was to come, in that Margaret Thatcher, who was then the leader of the Conservatives, she was watching very closely. And it was partly because of what happened at Brunswick that she introduced her trade union legislation in the 80s. And so a lot, the ripple effects from Brunswick were huge, despite the fact that they weren't successful. And we can see those effects, for the decades to come.
I guess, first of all, why do you think that part of British history has been kind of sidelined? And then equally, whilst you were researching and organising the content of this book, were there any organisations or movements that you couldn't include?
Yes, both really good questions. I mean, I constantly scratched my head whilst I was putting the book together as to why don't we know about this? To the point where I thought, okay, maybe we don't know about this because actually I'm not onto something. Maybe it's not worth knowing, because if it was, then surely we'd know about it by now. But after I started speaking to a few people, I thought, oh, no, that's not the reason. Unfortunately, I think it's the same reason as to why we don't talk about things like empire. If we talk about anti-racism, we have to talk about racism. We have to delve into those kind of less positive aspects and quite overtly negative aspects of British history. And people don't necessarily want to do that. A lot of people aren't comfortable getting into that. It's why we focus on the successes in British history. Or if we talk about kind of failures, as it were, or what we've done in a more negative light, then that's from centuries ago. And so we don't really have necessarily the same moral connection to it. And so I think that if we talk about these movements, if we talk about what happened in the 60s to 80s, then we have to talk about the state. We have to talk about the state's complicity in what was going on. Not only the state's complicity, but the state's kind of active participation, we had to talk about things like the police and police brutality, and the fact that it was the police who killed a protester, Blair Peach, in Southall in 1979, which was then covered up, called a death by misadventure. And even though the report has now been released from the police saying that it was indeed one of the police, that still nothing has been done. We have to have those conversations, and no one wants to. And in terms of other movements, I think there was a lot around the Black Parents movement that I mentioned them, but they are definitely worth a chapter or so in themselves. The Black Parents movement was also another wide-ranging movement that focused on education and police brutality, and they also worked closely with the Black Students movement. And I think I also would have wanted to focus perhaps a bit more on women's movements. There were more women's movements that could have also, again, had chapters in themselves. Organizations like the South for Black Sisters, for example, who are still going today, and they started in 1979. So yeah, it was a tough call of who makes the cut. But the good thing is that I'm really hopeful that there will be more like this. That this isn't going to be the only book on this era and these movements. That there's still so much more to be said.
I think the bit that it wasn't a surprise in that it happened, but it was a surprise in the scale of it, which was the drug that was being administered disproportionately to brown and black women. Depro something?
Depo Provera, yeah.
That's it. I couldn't remember the name off the top of my head, unfortunately. So for those listening, could you explain the history of that and how it eventually kind of is, I guess, exposed and stopped? Because the book does continue to say that drugs, it does still exist and is still administered, but not necessarily in the way it was. So yeah, what is going on there?
Yeah, I think so. There were a few times, researching about racism is pretty heavy going at the best of times. But there were some times which really kind of had to stop in my day early and knocked me off my feet and had to go and take a long walk. And this was one of them. So yeah, the contraception, Depo-Provera, is an injectable contraception, and it was developed in the US in the late 70s. But it wasn't actually approved for use there because the side effects seemed to be quite harsh. I mean, at its worst, it was seen to perhaps cause cancer. At best, it would cause the stopping of periods, but even can cause sterility. But despite all this, it was actually approved for use in the UK under two very limited circumstances. One was if a partner had a vasectomy and waiting for that to take effect, or if a woman had a certain vaccination where it was dangerous to get pregnant during that time. And also, it could also be administered at a doctor's discretion. And so it was under this doctor's discretion that it was soon discovered that it was disproportionately administered to black and brown women. And not just administered to them, but administered to them without their consent. So in one circumstance, for example, there was a black girl who had a minor surgery for something else. And then she woke up and it also been found that she'd been given this contraception. And it was essentially a form of population control through the uterus. So by this point, by the late 70s, immigration control had all but stopped primary immigration. People were still coming over. These were family members and dependents. And because there was kind of all the control that could be in place there, then it was essentially, population control in another way. And doctors said as much. And they were also said, there's no point talking to Asian women about barrier methods because they don't know where their vaginas are. And so this was happening not also just to black and brown women, but to white working class women as well. There was one doctor in Glasgow in particular who was administering it to tens of working class white women, and she had like a point system. Whereas if you had a lower education, then you'd kind of be more eligible, bumped up the list to get this contraception. And it was the black and brown women's groups who realized this was happening and started to cause a ruckus. And it was also a rare example of working with white women's groups as well on this thing called the Ban the Jab campaign. And so black women were talking about it at the kind of annual conferences, at the OWAAD annual conferences. They wrote about it in their newsletters. Black women used their position in the NHS to bring it to people's attention. The idea was trying to raise awareness that it was happening, to get people to question their doctors and not just accept any sort of injections, and also to ultimately stop the practice. And so when the pharmaceutical company applied for a license for it to be more widely available, and then the Committee on the Safety of Medicine said, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, go ahead. We give you our approval. It was the first time in their history that the Minister for Health actually said, no, time out. I'm not going to approve this, which was huge. Even though he refused to admit it was because of this political attention it had been getting, this was huge. And so the committee had to do more investigations. It wasn't just rubber stamped, as was the usual process. And then the pharmaceutical company eventually appealed via the courts, and they won that appeal. And so it became more widely available in the UK, but under the proviso that informed consent was sought, including having translation support when necessary. And it also couldn't be used whilst a mother was breastfeeding in the first, 6 weeks or so, because it was also shown to otherwise affect milk and therefore affect the baby. So, it was a huge campaign. It still is a huge campaign in some parts of the world. And that was the other thing that the Black women's groups did, was to bring attention to how it was being used in other parts of the world. Like a lot of pharmaceuticals, Depo Provera was tested around the world. It was tested in Jamaica, in lots of parts of sub-Saharan Africa, like Zimbabwe and South Africa. In New Zealand, it was tested on Pacific Islanders. And Black women were at the forefront of bringing this also to attention, never forgetting the kind of international ramifications of how it was used. But yeah, it's still in use today. It's still available in the UK and worldwide. And it was a very insidious period of history for sure. But it also really, I think, explains why there is such a distrust of the medical system. We know the stats and figures today as well for things like Black maternal health and brown maternal health. We know things like COVID, the rate of the take-up of the COVID vaccination is quite low. And is it any wonder? Really, when you had things like this that were happening?
I just wanted to ask, how did these groups figure out that this drug was being used disproportionately to them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know the exact mechanisms. I think what I could say is like, because there was a lot of discussion, and because I think with the networks that existed at the time that don't exist today, I think it would probably have come out pretty quickly, especially with the number of Black women who are working in the NHS and kind of also saw firsthand. Probably also some of these women were actually offered the jab themselves. I think it was something that people were particularly kind of looking aware of in terms of their treatment, especially around their reproductive health. So whilst the women's liberation movement, who was mainly composed of white women, were campaigning for access to abortions, for example, Black women were like, no, actually we don't want to campaign for abortions. We can really easily get abortions. If anything, we want to have children. So it was all part of this wider system as well that they were very, very attuned to.
How do your own personal experiences and your background, how did they influence your approach to writing the book?
Yeah, it's funny because I actually, even though there's like the Blair Peach School, for example, in Southall, but I didn't really know about any of this growing up. I think, and I think this is something that, people were particularly interested in, because I think one of the things that people were particularly interested in was the networks that existed at the time that don't exist today. We know things like COVID, the rate of the take-up of the COVID vaccination is quite low. And we know things like Which I think then actually was the catalyst, because when I started researching and I came across Glenwick, and then I started coming across other things and what happened in Southall, and I was like, hang on a second. Like, this is exactly when, my parents were around, my family was around, and I've not heard of any of this. And I'm starting to ask my cousins, and they're like, no, we haven't heard about these things either. And then I'd ask my parents, they're like, oh, yeah, we were there. Yeah. I was like, oh, yeah, we used to go on these marches and things. I'm like, what? You haven't said anything.
Never told
My dad's
me.
like, I was bussed. Like,
What?
I had no idea, because a lot of that generation, because they want to say the past is the past, they don't want to burden us with it, and kind of just keep the head down and carry on. And so I think, a lot of my kind of motivation, I was really interested in researching the history of Southall and beyond, and obviously the women's history as well. But I think more widely, it was just what would help me understand the UK as it is today. Like, what is it? What is going on? I was so confused in 2016 when the Brexit vote happened, and then this rise in racist violence, and I had no context for any of this. It felt so out of place, and so I really wanted to understand why the Conservative Party keeps getting voted in, and why is it that they're allowed to get away with a lot of the things that they say, as we've seen in the last few weeks as well. And so I found all those answers in this history and in these movements, and so that guided a lot of my research.
I'm glad that you said that you put the book together in order to make more sense of today, because that's exactly the impression I got reading it. And it's just brilliant that kind of the objective that you started off with is exactly what you've managed to push through this book. And it genuinely is it is something that I think everyone should have on their bookshelves. I've still got 3 chapters left, but the 8 that I've got through, absolutely brilliant. And I've been annotating it and writing notes and all sorts in the sidelines.
Well, you know better than I do at this point.
and putting in these little tabs and stuff just to get on top of it. And it's honestly a brilliant book, to the point where I'm actually understanding more of the context even that my family grew up in, or my family arrived in. Now, how do you think legacies of empire and colonialism have shaped the experiences of black and brown communities in the UK?
Before I put that aside, though, I wanted to also highlight that what's really interesting, especially in the kind of early movements I discuss in the book, things like the Bristol Bus Boycott and the Mangrove Nine and Black Power, is that a lot of the people involved in those movements were born in the colonies. And they were born also as they saw resistance to the empire in those colonies. And so they brought those politics over with them. Also with the Indian Workers Association, they brought over independence politics. And so they were primed and trained and ready. The leader of the British Black Panthers, Althea Jones-LeCrant, she was involved in politics in Trinidad, and her whole family was. Her sister, unfortunately, died because of her involvement in the movement in Trinidad. And so they brought those politics over with them. And that's what spurred them on when they first got to the UK to imagine something different and to resist. And I think that's really important context, because that is obviously the beginning of all of these movements that I'm talking about, and creates that model then for those to come. And then in terms of the next generations that were then born and raised in the UK, had no aspirations to kind of go back to the mother country, as some of the initial migrants did. I mean, it's impossible to get away from empire and colonialism. I think at its most base level, the fact is that even with that, a lot of white Brits do not think that brown and black people deserve to be here, even though they came here as British citizens on the same rights. They were not seen as equal. I mean, there's the famous adage of, we are here because you were there, and that still holds today. We see ramifications of it all the time, obviously, in the Windrush generation now, and the horrific deportations that have been happening. on a personal note, I had to, my daughter was born abroad, and having to apply for her passport was a 6-month saga, because trying to prove how my parents have their citizenship when they're born in India and Kenya. And I'm like, well, you colonized them. Like, you know this information, you have this information, but having to try and prove that back to the state under these immigration laws that were designed to keep people like me out was very, very jarring. And so this continues to kind of wrap its tendrils, its tentacles around us in ways that we can't even imagine. It's even from things like Black women when they joined the NHS, when they first came over, they were only allowed to join at a lower level. They were never allowed to join at a certain kind of a higher level with higher pay, even though they were fully qualified to do so. And so it's a lot of the reason why Black and brown people and certain communities within Black and brown communities have worse poverty outcomes, have worse educational outcomes, have worse health outcomes. I mean, it's not our fault. And I think that was a really big kind of insight that I had from researching the book. I'm like, hang on a second, this is all designed this way. It's not because, this is all part of the master plan to kind of to keep us inferior, essentially. And it might sound really quite crude or quite basic, and I think that's because actually it is. I mean, if you look at a lot of the language that the MPs used then and the MPs use now, talking about swarms of people and hurricanes of people, like, it is very crude and it is very basic.
Well, what is it? Braverman gave that speech recently and it was dubbed the new Enoch Powell's, Rivers of Blood.
Rivers of Blood.
Yeah,
yep.
It was. And if you actually do put the two speeches side by side, Suella Braverman's is far more right wing and insanely populist in its use of language and kind of essentially dehumanizing anyone who is trying to seek refuge.
So now, funny enough on that, because actually after Enoch Powell made that speech, he was kind of sidelined from the Conservatives. But, there's no consequences for Braverman, right?
We're definitely never going to see anything like that happen nowadays, right? I just wanted to go back to something that you said about how a lot of these people had come from colonies and they had been born in abroad, essentially, and then come to the UK. Now, it's interesting because I often have a conversation with my dad, and he was born in Kenya and came over in the 70s as a result of Idi Amin kicking everyone out of Uganda, and there was my grandfather was related to politics or something, so they had to leave anyway. And often we get into a conversation with that generation has a particular understanding that our generation lacks, in that they've come from some other culture, they've come from another world, so to speak. And I've never actually put it in the way that you did, but the way that you put it out, which was actually, it was because of that framing and context that kind of gave them an ability or a fire to say, hold on, we're not dealing with this. We deserve more. And I was saying to my dad that once that generation, who are now sadly passing away, is gone, we're now down to then the first full generation, so to speak, where we're all born we're all essentially in a home from home. Because I don't necessarily feel British, but there's no way I would feel Kenyan, and I don't necessarily feel Indian. And then my mom's side of the family are Hindu, Bengali, and white, blonde hair, blue-eyed Christians. So I don't really fit in with Brahmins, and I don't fit in with Christians, right? Like blonde hair, blue-eyed. That's not. So it's just really interesting at how, and I really like the way that you kind of turned that almost around to say, hold on, actually it's because of that heritage and background and context that helped them come here and kind of change things. I'd never quite viewed it like that, so I have to say.
And it's really interesting because then we see in the late 70s when that first generation kind of born in the UK starting to come of age, they're the ones then at the vanguard of the new movements, like the Asian youth movements. That kind of came about partly because they weren't happy with what the old folk were doing with things like the Indian Workers Association, because they're like, no, we're British, we were born here, we're not going anywhere, we need to really fight for our right to be here because we belong here as much as anyone else does. No, you're right, it's really interesting. Yeah, absolutely, kind of that generation who are born elsewhere will soon no longer be with us.
And that history makes a lot of sense in the context of why then as a child, my dad would always say you have to be twice as good as your white counterpart. Yeah. And I would always be like, what the and I just thought oof, I'm sure most brown people listening to this can relate, which is the pressure to do well academically is something as a child you're just like, for fuck's sake, leave me alone. I just want to go to school and be a child. Obviously you get older and you're like, I'm so glad my parents did that, and I'm so glad my dad told me that, because actually you don't realize. And then when you have those instances where you're like, hold on, did I just get ignored or passed over because of my color rather than my ability, is devastating for a child. But to be given that kind of mentality of, look, just perform twice as good as everyone else and you'll be fine. It's a sad reality in that we have to do that, but it also makes sense, like the history of where they've come from, what they've had to deal with. Like some of the stories my dad's told me about trying to get jobs when he first came here, applying to work at I think it was a Holiday Inn in Leicester or a hotel in Leicester. And the guy said to my dad he could have the job as long as he cut his beard and took his turban off.
Yeah.
And my dad was like, well, fuck this one, I'm out. And eventually that spurred him on to set up his own business, and things worked out. And we're now standing on his shoulders thanks to the work that he's done. But yeah, and hence why I find your book that interesting, because it doesn't just make sense of history in terms of this narrative that's out there, but it makes sense of my own life and makes sense of my own family, and that I think is really unique. Like not a lot of books kind of have that type of personal connection.
Please.
Oh, okay. So a few questions left. I'm maybe gonna leave this one till a little bit later, but let me ask you this. So based on your research and the stories you've uncovered, what do you think are the key factors or catalysts that lead to real lasting change in society?
Yeah, I think there were two main factors. I think this is also this kind of a similar answer I give when thinking about what we can take from the movements today. And one of them is solidarity. Like, some people have asked me why I chose to focus on Black and brown movements and not kind of one or the other. And I'm like, well, there's no choice. I mean, this era was this incredible solidarity. Like two members of the Black Panther Core Executive Committee were brown. If my cover, for those who are watching and not listening, like, I love this cover because it shows Barbara Beese, who was a Black Panther in the East End of London, supporting the Bengalis. And she's there with her son, which I love, this kind of intergenerational aspect of it. And on the other side of her son, unfortunately cut off, but is Marla Sen, who was one of the Black Panthers. And she's holding, the other hand of her son. And I love, it just kind of encapsulates, I think, what the book is about in terms of the solidarity between communities. And so I think that is something that we have definitely lost. And that's why I also end it in 1981, because that we see from the 1980s onwards, this kind of dismantling of solidarity. It's not that saying everything was great and there weren't divisions. Of course there were. But there was a solidarity to a greater extent than we have today. And then I think the second thing is disruption. It's disruption, but especially economic disruption. I think that often we like to devoid class from race today, and it is definitely more complicated than it was. Mostly back then, you could say most Black and brown people were all working class, and that's not the same as it is today. But I think disruption and realizing that actually we're not going to get anywhere just by signing petitions and like tweeting about things. I mean, that's what I love to do, but it's not going to make much change, unfortunately. But it's what disrupts. It's why I am so heartened by all the strikes that we see, because it is only by taking action that is disruptive will we see any great change, and especially economic disruption. Taking away our labor in droves is the kind of thing that leads to change.
In light of recent revelations such as the radiation experiments on Punjabi women in Coventry during the 60s, which make more sense in light of me reading the Depo Prevo chapter, because it makes sense of then how the lack of consent for Asian women in medicine was just a commonplace idea at this point by the sounds of things. And then on top of that, we've had manifestations of Asian anti-blackness evident in instances like the hair shop situation that's still ongoing. Now, how do you see these events being influenced by the history that precedes it, and also influencing and shaping the current discourse on race and activism?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And yeah, I was shocked about the radioactive. I mean, they call it radioactive chapati. They call it radioactive roti. They're really missing a trick there. I hadn't come across that in my research, and I was like, are you kidding me? There's more out there. There's more examples of brown women's rights and bodies just being completely violated. And so, okay, in terms of 2 questions, you're asking about how was influenced by what preceded it, and then kind of what comes after. I think, okay, so for the 60s, as we've seen, brown women were not, brown women and brown women's bodies were seen as kind of open business. We see that with virginity testing, which happened on brown women coming into the country. We see that with things like Depo Provera. That consent, that bodily integrity and dignity were not afforded to brown and black women in the same way. And so I see that as, I mean, that basically fits in with, it's not surprising given the narrative I know of the 60s, 80s, that happened. There was no part of me that thought, oh, that's strange. Yeah. Like,
That's a shock.
That's a shock, yeah. Like, oh, that goes against everything that I know about that time. No, it fits in completely. I mean, it still has the ability to disgust and disappoint, but definitely not surprised that also happened. And there's more that we don't know about as well, right? And then, but in terms of talking about today, and then that incident you're talking about in Peckham, like, now this is really interesting because, we are at a time when I think it's a perfect example of that we have very little appreciation of our commonalities as oppressed minorities. And it shows just kind of how far we've come since the 80s, or how far backwards we've gone since the 80s. So a lot of people are talking about that incident in terms of this kind of like colonial divide and rule, and how a lot of, I mean, we're at the stage now where, like, I can't remember where the gentleman was from, the manager of the store, but speaking kind of in terms of the Indian community, a lot of Indians in particular think they're better than everyone else. And I'm saying this as being embedded in this community, and so speaking from that experience of seeing this happen. And there's a lot of anti-blackness, a lot also Islamophobia within Sikhs and Hindus, and there's a lot of Indians, for example, who voted for Brexit. About, I think, 40% of Indians voted for Brexit based on anti-immigration arguments. They might say, oh, no, it's for business, but it's mostly anti-immigration. And so I think the Peckham incident really kind of highlights all of that, highlights where we are today in terms of the fragmentation within our communities, and not just the incident itself, but I think the reaction to that incident. Those who are coming to the defense of the manager versus the defense of the black woman who was strangled by him. And it's really interesting. I've watched those videos, unfortunately, again and again and again. I'm trying to make sense of all of this. I'm like, yes, she is also lashing out at him, but there's just no possible defense for wrapping your hands around someone's neck. And the fact that is a reaction, that is an instinct of that man, shows this really deep-seated anti-blackness that we have, that the conversation started to be had in 2020 with Black Lives Matters, but is still really, really embedded today. And yeah, I think it shows, unfortunately, I mean, the kind of sad state of affairs that we've come to in the last 30, 40 years.
My last question, and I've absolutely enjoyed the last hour or so that we've been talking about this, and there's so much more that we could discuss, like even the bit that you commented about how diversity in the police force, like that's worked out, right? And that itself is probably a podcast in its own right. But I wanted to ask, considering you've written this book, and I don't know how other people have taken to it, but I genuinely think it's one of the best books that I've had the pleasure to read. Do you have any other projects in the pipeline? Are there any other underexplored historical events or stories that you're interested in kind of researching more? Like, do you have anything planned?
Yeah, absolutely, because I'm a sucker and apparently want to keep doing this kind of stuff. Yeah, I think there's definitely still some unfinished business with this book. You know, there, for example, and I'm glad it's not just coming from me. People have asked me as well. They're like, and so when are we going to have a Grunwick film? And I'm like, yes, we need a film about Grunwick. Interestingly, Gurinder Chadha said on Twitter the other day that she was wanting to make a film a few years ago, but could not get it off the ground. Like, there's just no funding still for kind of these all brown casts, which is madness, especially from someone like Gurinder Chadha, that she can't get this kind of thing greenlit. But yeah, if you have any know any filmmakers, then Grunwick definitely used to be a film, and obviously I'd love to be involved with something like that. So there's that. There's also, I think, some work to be done around bringing these kind of stories to an educational context. A lot of work to be done in that scene. And then I want to keep exploring activism. I think I want to focus on women. And yeah, so that's all I can say at the moment. But I think, there's definitely so much more to be done around kind of what leads to change and who's driving that change. And I'm especially interested in, I'm still interested in movements. I'm interested in individuals, but I'm interested in movements and groups, and and what that looks like in different places around the world.
No, thank you. Well, whatever you work on in future, I will definitely be keeping an eye on it, because if this book is anything to go by, I'm sure that will be just as exceptional. So no, and yeah, I can only just say thanks once again.
Thank you to you. It's been, it's always a delight to talk to people about the book, especially people who've so closely read it.
And that's the end of another intriguing podcast episode. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating this podcast. If you're passionate about the work I'm doing and want to support it, consider becoming a paid YouTube member to unlock some cool features, or join our Patreon community. You can find the links in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll hopefully see you in the next video. Bye!